I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. Today I'm joined by NYU professor Kwame Anthony Appiah. He's also the ethicist columnist in the New York Times Magazine, a pioneering philosopher, author on identity, race, and other provocative contemporary issues. His latest book, The Lies That Bind. Professor, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. An op-ed piece in the Times, an opinion piece recently, talked about college students and saying that classes may begin with requests for preferred pronouns, land acknowledgments. A student who jokes about the wrong subject might face social punishment. All students, the op-ed writer said, should welcome challenges to their most cherished beliefs. But from what he'd seen on campus, students are not invited to debate. They are expected to conform. How much of this have you seen on campus, and how bad is it for the academic environment for learning?
That hasn't really, I know all these stories, of course, and I read the Times, but I don't have the same experience. I mean, it is true that a generation is growing up that cares about things like pronouns and so on, and so either you respond to that or you don't, and I don't mind responding to that if people care about it. So on my university email it says he, him, or whatever, he, his, him, under my name. So I don't mind that. I can see that some people think it's in some way kind of making too much of a big deal about something, and you know, they're entitled to their opinion. But in terms of being willing to challenge, you know, to challenge arguments, I have never had a lot of students who wanted to do that, and I've been teaching for more than 40 years now. But I've always had some, and I don't feel there are many fewer than there used to be. Maybe a few fewer. Mm-hmm. So the first question is that kind of description? Does that kind of description reflect my own sense of my own experience in my own classes? And I think on the whole the answer to that is no. But
probably because you encourage debate in your class.
Well, I hope so. I mean, that's what we're teaching people in philosophy. I mean, the first thing I say to them is, I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. I'm trying to give you tools for thinking about what you should think for yourself. Of course, I'll express my views, but don't think that the object of the exercise is for you to come to have my views. And indeed, I often give them things to read by me, which I disagree with now, just to know that you can change your mind as well. You don't have to stick with you don't have to duke it out for a position just because you laid it out once. So, yeah, I think it's important to have a context on campus where, especially in classrooms, people are free to say what they genuinely believe and to raise questions about things they genuinely have questions about. That doesn't mean that you don't want to have an atmosphere of courtesy and respect, and I don't think in the classroom free expression is limited by the aims of the class. So I don't think students should be free to bring up anything they want, because my class isn't about high energy physics or nuclear engineering, and fascinating as it is and wonderful as it would be to talk about it outside the classroom has a focus. And it doesn't just have a content focus. We try to discuss things in a way that advances our understanding, and that means you don't insult people, you don't roll your eyes when people say things, you know, because that doesn't advance the process. You don't get punished for doing those things, but I think it's appropriate for a professor to point out that those are not helpful ways of behaving, and appropriate for students to criticize colleagues of theirs who violate those kinds of norms of courtesy. But, you know, it's always been the case, forever I'd be inclined to say, but certainly anywhere I've been and looking at the historical record, it's always been the case that it's hard to speak up for positions that are sort of away from the current consensus in your society. This is what John Stuart Mill complained about in On Liberty. He wasn't just talking about government censorship, he was talking about social pressure to conform your opinions to others, and he was urging us to listen to one another and to allow and to be willing to talk to people and to listen to people who have views that we think are profoundly mistaken.
I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but now it seems, at least according to editorial opinion, that it's a minority, maybe even a tiny minority, that people feel is imposing words that I hate to use, like cancel culture or woke philosophy, that is shutting down some of that debate, particularly in colleges where if it doesn't occur there, where would it occur?
Yes.
So how do you guard against that, against going overboard, the pendulum swinging too far the other way?
Well, again, that the life of the university is, to stick with your metaphor, the life of many pendulums. We go back and forth all the time on things, and we go back and forth on issues within our subjects. And yes, you can move from a situation that's unfortunate in one way too far away from that in a direction that's unfortunate in another way. I think the important thing is for universities to encourage that kind of open debate in the classroom. I don't think you can have cancel culture in the classroom. That's not, as I said, it's fine to say to somebody, very interesting, but not the topic of this class. That seems to me fine, and that is a limitation on freedom of expression, but it's a perfectly appropriate one. Outside the classroom, I think people should be allowed to talk about anything they like, but also along with freedom of expression goes freedom of association. So if you don't like what someone's talking to you about, you can stop the conversation and
walk away.
Move on. I do worry that, I think maybe part of the problem is that the institutions themselves, and universities vary enormously in how their leadership handles these things. The University of Chicago famously has a very robust, active promulgation of ideas about freedom of expression. I think that it's right, and the president of Johns Hopkins published a book last year arguing this. I think the university itself could be more active in promoting discussion rather than just permitting discussion, actually encouraging discussion that explores the full range of serious opinion in society. I don't think we have to invite everybody to campus. I don't think we have a duty to listen to flat earthers or
anti-vaxxers.
Or anti-vaxxers. The university is the site of knowledge, and the knowledge that we have of the university shows that vaccination for a wide range of conditions is a perfectly useful method of preventing and mitigating the effects of diseases, and it's one where protecting oneself goes along with helping to protect others. So it's a sort of pro-social thing to do as well as a self-protective thing to do. Now, that's what virologists and public health people know. The university is the home of virologists and public health people. It's not obliged to listen to people who have bad arguments for the opposite conclusion. I think we could do more to correct error than we sometimes feel we must. We sort of think, well, there are idiots out there, why should we spend our time on them? Well, I think because we're kind of sources of knowledge, it's good to have websites that's on your university websites that say that what the truth is as it's currently understood about something. So I don't mean that we should let anybody come on campus and say anything, but if someone's within the range of, particularly in political opinion, within the range of opinion that's, say, currently represented in the US Congress, then surely they should be allowed to come on campus if somebody wants to talk to them, and surely we should listen to them whether we agree with them or not.
Oh, well, let me ask you a very sensitive question that is sensitive even for me to ask. The op-ed piece the Times ran by Tom Cotton, senator, about perhaps using the National Guard in the Black Lives Matter protests. A lot of debate about whether that piece should have run. Of course, maybe it could have been edited better. but it seems that here was a United States senator voicing this opinion, an unpopular opinion with a great deal of our readers, an unpopular opinion with a number of our staff members, but he was a United States senator voicing it, not some, schlemiel on the street.
Right.
Should our readers have been entitled to hear that point of view from a United States senator?
I think that a United States senator counts as exactly the sort of person whose opinions you have to listen to whether you like them or not. I grew up, I had the good fortune to learn this growing up because my grandmother, when she got older, moved from a bigger house into a cottage next door. And she sold the big house to a man who was, at that point, probably the most right-wing member of the British Parliament. Mm-hmm. And he was our neighbour. This is in England. And we became very friendly with him. And he was an incredibly nice man. And he did many kind things for me. I went to the college at Cambridge I went to because it was his college. And he took me there to see it because my parents didn't live in England. So here he was, this person I liked. And he was our neighbour. And my grandmother liked him. And I liked his wife and so on. And he had all these, to me, I was a young lefty, appalling views. And I learned that that it was important to be friends, to be able to be friends with people who had terrible views. He taught me fly fishing as well. So he was like a sort of grandfather to me. So I think I learned that. I learned that you can like someone who's badly wrong. And I think...
And that they are entitled to express...
And that they, of course, yes. I remember actually coming back from my first visit to Cambridge. It was the weekend before there was a vote in Parliament to reintroduce capital punishment, or to abandon the experiment of abolishing capital punishment. And I spent 3 hours trying to persuade him to vote the other way. And I just recently checked on this, and I looked in Hansard, the record of the British Parliament. He was the first person to speak in favour of the reintroduction.
So much for your powers of persuasion.
So I think it's there are issues about the constraining the mode of expression. You shouldn't shout at people. You shouldn't use insults in a serious discussion. They don't help. But I don't think you should, for example, rule out getting indignant. Some things it's appropriate to be indignant about. Some things it's appropriate to have strong feelings about. And I think that we should be willing to listen to the full range of opinion in our own society, especially if we're talking to people who are willing to listen to us. I mean, we want these things to be dialogues. But even if they're not, I think knowing that Senator Cotton thought that is an interesting thing to know about the United States Senate, that it contained someone who thought that was a reasonable proposal. And I have been actually recently, I give talks on campuses around the country, and recently I've been talking a lot about the need for us as a country, not as a university, but as a country, to pay more attention to the views of the people on the other team, on Team Conservative, Team Republican, Team Democrat, Team Liberal, Team Progressive. We're not, I don't know whether we're worse at this than we've ever been, maybe we're not, but we're not good enough at it. And universities should play a role. Universities have an important role here in bringing, with our convening power, bringing together people across the spectrum to discuss important topics.
And allowing people or encouraging people to listen. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about some questions and quandaries from Anthony Appiah's weekly column, The Ethicist. Kwame Anthony Appiah, let's talk about his weekly column, The Ethicist, in the New York Times Magazine. First, let me ask you a question, though, about an issue that has overwhelmed all of us, not just now, but forever, and that is race. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we can spend hours on it, but I was in the Middle East not all that long ago, and I was with an anthropologist who took a Tupperware container, opened it, and showed me the skull of what was supposedly the oldest person ever found, millions of years old. And I said, well, who is this person? And he was thoughtful about it. He said it was a woman, first of all. It was probably a teenager. And I said, well, what was the race of the person? And the anthropologist said, there's no question, the person was black. person came out of Africa like everyone else did at the beginning. So why, millions of years later, are we still consumed by race and the nature of blackness as being not only something different, but being something sort of inferior?
I think it's important that while there have always been, since the origin of our species, variations within the group, within humanity, things that you might call subspecies or something, or variations, the vast majority of the ancestry of all modern humans was in Africa until 100, 150,000 years ago. And so, for example, with the exception of a few possible albinos, nobody was white. White skin, lighter skin evolved as people moved away from the tropics because it was adaptive to have lighter skin. So those modern categories we use, black, white, yellow, brown, red, sort of those categories, are relatively, they're both historically relatively modern, I mean, in terms of biological time, but in terms of historical time, it's also true that the particular preoccupation with that set of categories is really not something that you find until sort of 17th, 18th century in Europe. Mm-hmm. In the early 18th century, a young man, a 4-year-old boy, was taken from Ghana to Germany. He was given to the Dukes of Wolfenbüttel. They sent him to school with their children, and he was the Duke's godson, and he became a professor of philosophy in the 1720s, 1730s. That was an experiment, but they weren't assuming that there was very much to be said about the capacities of black people. That hostile sense of black people in particular, Negroes, as a particularly sort of despised kind, that's really something that arises in Europe with the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of ideology that develops in order to justify, in a way, the slave trade. Mm-hmm. It's relatively modern. Why? I mean, once you get something like that up and running, it can be really hard to close it down.
And it's a legacy that we're still living with. Let me ask you some questions from the Ethicist column. One, can I use my adopted child's DNA to find his biological parents? What do you think of that?
Well, so you might think, as it were, why not? And the worry that the writer had was that they had adopted a child from China, a legal adoption from China, and if they started putting their child's DNA records into the relevant databases, since there's very little privacy protections for DNA data in China, and in particular because the Chinese state feels free to use mm-hmm. that information any way it likes, as it were, there was a privacy worry about I'm taking a decision for this child. Mm-hmm. The child's data will then be out there, and I can't really retrieve it. Can't retrieve it. And so can I take this decision for the child? Normally, if you had an adult child, you would just ask them, and you would ask their permission, and if they gave you permission, you could do it. If they didn't give you permission, you couldn't do it. But he was talking about a young child. And I think the answer is that the dangers that he was worried about are less serious for a child who's an American citizen living in America sending their Chinese data to China than they would be for a Chinese child living in China, where there might be questions about how the government might abuse the data. So that was my basic thought. No, just to say, I mean, notice that in this case, while the privacy concern is an ethical question, whether it matters is a factual question, mm-hmm. because you need to know something about, you have to look into what's going on. And we found somebody who runs a system for helping adopted Chinese children adopted from China in the United States to find their family. And one problem is, and this I was able to tell them, is at the moment, given what's in the databases, you have a very small probability of finding anybody.
Anyway, I think my friend could be autistic. Do I tell her?
Yeah, the worry there is that nobody likes to be to have their behavior interpreted through a kind of psychiatric syndrome, right? I mean, the most annoying thing your spouse can say to you is, you're in a bad mood because you've spent too much time at work, and instead of, as it were, taking your objection seriously. That's sort of annoying. So people don't like to be seen in that sort of medicalizing way. But there are, on the other hand, people with, who are on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, who have shared interests and a shared set of challenges, and they get together, and sometimes they call themselves Aspies. I mean, they've given themselves a name, and I think helping someone to see that there might be a community like that out there that might help them would be a gift of friendship. So that the task is to do it in a way that isn't treating the person as if you're saying, I interpret everything you do as if you are, incapable of understanding human emotions or something like that. That's not the right way to go about it. But the right way to go about it, I think, is to say, it occurs to me you might be on the spectrum. I'm not a doctor, but it just occurs to me. And if you are, here's some things I happen to have discovered where you can find like-minded people if you want to.
Is it okay to lie these days? Rupert Murdoch admits that Fox News commentators lied about the stolen election. George Santos not only lied, but the people who advanced his candidacy, or even the people who opposed his candidacy, apparently were aware of some of the lies he told. Is lying all right?
Well, no. It's, in fact, I think it's more serious than people realize, because the fundamental thing about our species that makes us distinct is that we can share information. Dogs can share very, very basic information with one another, but I can learn from you that there's a pharmacy open 5 blocks away and how to get there. We're the only animal that can do that. And that's why we can build buildings and invent televisions and cell phones and send people to Mars. So polluting the framework of information sharing is undermining the most distinctive human advantage. So I think it's very wrong, not just to lie, but to carelessly spread false information. That's something that people do a lot nowadays because they like tweets which contain false information, and they haven't checked on it. So they're spreading on this alleged information, and they're, as it were, polluting the waters of knowledge. So it's not only very often that lying is a betrayal of a relationship, that it's but that it's really a kind of fundamental abuse of speech and of communication, which has this enormous potential for good, and it pollutes that. So I think it's very bad. Now, we can ask the question whether there aren't contexts, and I think there are, in which lying isn't the worst thing you can do. But
there are white lies.
There are white lies, but also there are serious contexts. I mean, I don't think that. I mean, the obvious sort of example is you're in an authoritarian state, and the security people, the police, knock on the door and they say, "Do you have so and so in the cellar?" And you do. Well, if they'll go away if you say he isn't there, I say, feel free to and be as convincing as you can.
That's a good line. Thanks to Kwame Anthony Appiah, who writes the Ethicist column for the New York Times Magazine. And coming up next, my thoughts on separation of church and state. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart famously non-defined obscenity by saying he knew it when he saw it. Bill Clinton confined his definition of having sexual relations to the present tense, but famously added the qualifier, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. So what exactly did Mayor Adams mean the other day when he disavowed the separation of state and church? Well, it depends what the meaning of church is. Let's start by defining the word broadly to include mosques, synagogues, tabernacles, shrines, other places of worship. Let's go beyond mere physical spaces to encompass a universal code of spiritual beliefs grounded in ethics, morality, charity, mutual respect. The closest the Constitution comes to separating church and state is barring Congress from legislating the establishment of religion and prohibiting its free exercise. The columnist Charles Krauthammer once wrote, quote, "I don't believe in God, but I fear him greatly." So do most of our public officials, although most fear the wrath of their constituents even more. Congress inserted "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s to distinguish American democracy from godless communism. The nation's official motto is, "In God we trust." We sing, "God bless America." We enlist religious figures to routinely bless official functions. The oath of office administered on a Bible typically ends with, "So help me God." We wink at government spending for so-called faith-based public-private partnerships, some because they actually do good, others because politicians are beholden to the religious leaders who demand the spending. The mayor is indeed a chosen one, but chosen by New York voters on faith to lead this city. If he hopes to be chosen for a second term, he will have to redeem his campaign promises and learn to practice what he's been preaching. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.